John Hayward, a disciplined ex-military man, discovers his wife Rachel's betrayal through a private investigator's damning evidence. With meticulous precision, John devises a plan to expose her lies, turning their quiet life into a battlefield of truth and retribution.
John Hayward was not a man prone to paranoia. As a former Army captain, he had spent years honing his ability to assess situations with precision and detachment. His training had drilled into him one unshakable principle: trust evidence, not emotions. Yet over the past few months, a growing unease had taken root, whispering that something was amiss in his marriage to Rachel. The changes were subtle at first, barely noticeable, small shifts in her behavior that could easily be dismissed as stress or exhaustion. Rachel, always the composed and charismatic HR manager, had begun staying later at work. "Deadlines are killing me," she explained one evening, stepping through the door an hour past her usual time, a faint sheen of sweat on her brow despite the cool autumn air. "It's like this project never ends," she sighed, setting her designer bag on the counter. John didn't press her. He understood the demands of a busy career, though the hours stretched on more frequently than before. Still, her explanations left a nagging itch at the back of his mind, one he couldn't scratch away. One night, as Rachel prepared for bed, John noticed her phone. It never left her side these days. Once an afterthought, casually tossed onto the coffee table or left charging by the kitchen sink, it was now glued to her hand. She even took it with her when she showered. "What's with the phone?" he asked lightly, watching as she placed it screen down on the nightstand. She barely glanced at him. "Emails," she said casually, pulling the covers over her shoulder. "The office has been chaotic lately." "More chaotic than usual?" he pressed, his voice steady but probing. Her laugh was light, dismissive. "You have no idea." She turned out the lamp before he could reply. John lay awake long after she fell asleep, staring at the faint glow of her phone. For the first time in their 15-year marriage, he felt like an outsider looking in. The physical distance between them was harder to ignore. Rachel used to curl up against him in bed, her head resting on his chest. Now she claimed she was too tired or that her back hurt. Nights without intimacy turned into weeks. When John reached for her, she would kiss him quickly, almost out of obligation, before rolling away. "Is everything okay between us?" he asked one evening, his voice calm but direct. She froze momentarily, then forced a smile. "Of course it is. Why wouldn't it be?" He searched her eyes for a trace of sincerity, but found only a practiced facade. Before each of John's business trips, Rachel's mood noticeably improved. She would hum softly to herself while folding laundry or preparing dinner, her steps lighter. He wanted to believe she was simply enjoying the solitude, the break from routine. Yet the timing was too consistent to ignore. One Saturday morning, as he packed for an overnight trip, he noticed her watching him. She leaned against the kitchen doorway, her expression unreadable, her phone in her hand as always. "You'll be back tomorrow?" she asked casually. "Yes," John replied, folding a shirt neatly into his duffel bag. "Why? Got big plans?" Rachel laughed, a little too brightly. "Hardly. Just dinner with some girlfriends." "Which ones?" She hesitated, a flicker, brief but telling. "You don't know them," she said quickly. "From work." "Ah," John said, zipping his bag. "Have fun." He kissed her on the cheek, his mind already racing. That evening, as he drove back from his meeting, John couldn't shake the feeling that he was being lied to. His gut told him there was more to Rachel's late nights, her sudden obsession with her phone, and the inexplicable glow she carried whenever he was away. When he walked into the house, the lights were off, and Rachel was gone. A note on the counter read, "Don't wait up. Dinner ran late." John stared at the note for a long moment, his jaw tightening. His suspicions were no longer just whispers. They were screaming now. The note Rachel had left on the counter burned in John's mind. "Don't wait up. Dinner ran late." It was so casual, so dismissive, as if the woman he had spent 15 years with, the mother of his child, had nothing to hide. But John knew better. He'd seen too much in his life to ignore the signs. Sitting in his dimly lit home office, John stared at the note, rereading it like it held the key to a puzzle he couldn't solve. His military instincts screamed at him to act. This wasn't the battlefield, but the rules of engagement were the same. Gather intel, evaluate the threat, execute a plan. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. A name stood out. Martin Kane, private investigator. The call. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Kane Investigations." "Martin, it's John Hayward." "John," Martin replied, his tone lightening. "Haven't heard from you since, what, the embassy job?" "Yeah," John said, his voice steady. "This is personal, sensitive. I need someone I can trust." There was a pause, the sound of shuffling papers on the other end. "Go on." "It's my wife," John admitted, each word feeling heavier than the last. "Something's wrong. I think she's having an affair." Martin exhaled sharply. "You sure about this, John? Once you start down this road, there's no going back." "I'm not sure of anything," John replied. "That's why I need you." The next day, John met Martin at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. They sat in a corner booth, away from prying eyes, the faint hum of the coffee machine the only background noise. "You're still good at this, right?" John asked, pushing a folder across the table. Martin opened it, glancing at the photos inside, shots of Rachel at work events, a calendar with her frequent late nights marked in red, and John's notes detailing her changes in behavior. "Not bad for a civilian," Martin said with a smirk. "This isn't enough," John replied, ignoring the comment. "I need proof, concrete, undeniable proof. I need to know who he is, how long it's been going on, and everything else." Martin nodded, his expression serious. "Consider it done. I'll start tonight." 4 days later, Martin called. "We need to meet. I've got something." John felt his stomach tighten as he drove to the meeting spot, an unassuming parking lot near a hardware store. Martin's car was parked under a flickering street lamp, the shadows stretching like ghostly fingers across the asphalt. "Here," Martin said, handing over a manila envelope as John slid into the passenger seat. John hesitated for a moment before opening it. The first thing he saw was a photograph. Rachel, dressed in a sleek black dress, stepping out of a restaurant. Her hand was entwined with another man's, an office worker, by the look of him, his cheap suit slightly rumpled. "That's Edward Grayson," Martin explained. "Works with her at the firm. I followed them to a hotel after dinner. She stayed the night." John flipped to the next page, screenshots of text messages. Rachel: "I can't wait to see you again. He doesn't suspect a thing." Edward: "You're too good at this. Makes me feel sorry for the guy." Rachel: "Don't. He's as cold as ice. Emotional intimacy? Forget it." John's grip on the paper tightened. He could almost hear her voice in those words, laced with sarcasm and contempt. "Turn it over," Martin said. John flipped to the last item, a USB drive. "What's on this?" "Audio," Martin replied. "From the hotel room. She's not holding back, John. You need to prepare yourself." John didn't respond. He started the car and drove home in silence, the envelope resting on the seat beside him like a ticking bomb. That night, after locking the door to his office, John plugged the USB drive into his computer. Static crackled through his speakers, then voices emerged. "Rachel, I love you more than I ever loved him. With you, I can actually feel something." Edward: "Then why not leave him?" Rachel: "Because he's useful, for now." John pressed pause. His hand hovered over the mouse, his knuckles white. For the first time in years, he felt utterly unprepared. The manila envelope lay open on John's desk, its contents spread out like pieces of a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Each page, each photograph, each damning word from the text messages pierced him with an agony he hadn't thought possible. But it was the final blow, the DNA test, that turned his chest into a cold, hollow cavern. Liza Hayward, probability of paternity, 0%. The words stared back at him, cruelly simple, shattering everything he believed about his life, his family, his daughter. He leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling for the first time since the battlefield. The memories came rushing in, unbidden. Liza's first steps, her first scraped knee, the nights he stayed up helping her with math homework she didn't understand. He remembered the way she would look at him during her school recitals, her smile full of pride and trust, as though he was her entire world. How could she not be his? John stared at the test results, then at the photograph of Edward Grayson. The man didn't look like much. A balding, ordinary office worker with the posture of someone who spent too many hours at a desk. And yet, this man was the biological father of the child John had raised, loved, and protected for 13 years. His fists clenched. "You coward," he muttered under his breath, glaring at the image. The pain gave way to anger. His wife had not only betrayed him, but allowed another man to infiltrate the most sacred parts of their family. Worse, she had taken away John's right to know the truth. The clock ticked on as John remained in his office. Midnight came and went, but sleep felt like an impossible luxury. He opened the folder again, methodically examining each piece of evidence, as if trying to convince himself this was all real. He played the audio file from the USB drive, cringing as Rachel's voice filled the room. "I've never felt alive with him, not the way I do with you. He's just there. What if he finds out?" Edward's voice, timid and unsure. "He won't. He's too distracted, too obsessed with his work." John paused the recording, his hands gripping the desk so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You don't know me at all," he whispered to himself, his voice low and dangerous. A picture of Liza sat on his desk, framed in simple mahogany. She was smiling, her long brown hair tied back in a ponytail, holding a trophy from last year's spelling bee. John reached out, brushing his fingers against the glass. "No," he said aloud, his voice steady despite the storm raging within him. "She's my daughter. Nothing changes that." But the thought of Liza learning the truth made his chest tighten. How could he shield her from this? How could he keep her from being torn apart by the revelations he now held in his hands? By 3 a.m., John stood by the window, looking out at the quiet suburban street bathed in moonlight. He knew he couldn't confront Rachel immediately. Screaming accusations or throwing the evidence in her face wouldn't solve anything. She'd find a way to twist the narrative, to paint herself as the victim. No, this required precision. It required a plan. He walked back to his desk and picked up the photograph of Rachel and Edward, their hands intertwined as they left the restaurant. He stared at it for a long moment before placing it back in the folder. John grabbed a notebook and began writing. 1. Confront Rachel publicly. He wanted witnesses, undeniable proof, and nowhere for her to hide. Target Edward's weaknesses. A man like Edward, with his milquetoast demeanor and evident guilt, would crumble under pressure. 3. Protect Liza. Whatever happened, he had to ensure she was insulated from the fallout as much as possible. He wrote down the date of Rachel's next scheduled dinner with Edward, circled it in red, and underlined it twice. His gaze hardened. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about justice. For himself, for the years of lies, and for the love he'd poured into a family that had been built on betrayal. As dawn broke, John sat back in his chair, his exhaustion finally catching up to him. The evidence was neatly organized. the beginnings of a plan sketched out in meticulous detail. He knew there were risks. Rachel was cunning, and Edward would do anything to avoid exposure. But John had faced worse odds. He stood, closing the folder and locking it in the desk drawer. His mind was clear now, his purpose sharpened. In the stillness of the morning, one thought echoed in his mind. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. John stood in the doorway of his office, his military duffel bag slung over one shoulder, watching Rachel move about the kitchen. She was humming a soft tune, her movements light and casual. If he didn't know better, he might have mistaken her mood for simple happiness. But now, with the truth glaring at him, it felt like a mockery. He had carefully written the note that morning, placing it on the kitchen counter where she would inevitably see it. The crisp white paper contrasted against the dark granite countertop, stark and deliberate. The words were brief, calculated to give her a sense of false security. Rachel, I've been called away for an urgent business trip. I'll be back in 3 days. Take care of Liza. He didn't say where he was going. He didn't need to. The ambiguity would be her permission slip to indulge. John lingered by the kitchen table, letting the silence stretch as he mentally rehearsed every step of the act he was about to put on. Rachel finally noticed him standing there. "Oh, you're leaving already?" she asked, glancing at the clock. Her voice sounded casual, but he caught the subtle lift in her tone. "Yes," John replied, keeping his expression neutral. "Something came up last minute. I'll be back by the weekend." She wiped her hands on a dish towel and stepped closer, tilting her head as though she were trying to look concerned. "You work too hard, you know that? You should take a break sometime." John resisted the urge to scoff. Instead, he leaned in and kissed her lightly on the cheek. Her skin was warm, her scent familiar, but it no longer comforted him. It felt like the scent of betrayal. "Take care of Liza," he said firmly, meeting her eyes. Rachel nodded, her gaze flickering away. Of course. He noticed the way her shoulders seemed to relax ever so slightly, how the corners of her mouth lifted as though she were holding back a smile. She thought he was gone. That was all the confirmation he needed. John made his way upstairs to Liza's room. She was sitting cross-legged on her bed, her headphones on, scribbling in her notebook. When she saw him, her face lit up, and she pulled off the headphones. "You're leaving already?" she asked, her tone a mix of disappointment and curiosity. "Work," John said with a shrug, sitting on the edge of her bed. "You know how it is." Liza frowned. "But you'll be back for my recital, right? You promised." John's chest tightened. He reached out and gently ruffled her hair. "I'll always be there for you, Liz. You know that." Her smile returned, small but trusting. She leaned forward and hugged him, and John held her tightly, memorizing the feel of her arms around him. For a moment, the storm in his mind quieted, replaced by the simple, pure love he felt for his daughter. "Be good while I'm gone," he said as he pulled back. "Always," she replied, rolling her eyes in mock exasperation. Back downstairs, John grabbed his keys and duffel bag. Rachel was scrolling through her phone at the kitchen counter, a cup of coffee steaming beside her. She didn't look up when he said, "I'll call if I can." "Safe travels," she said, her voice light and unconcerned. As John stepped out the door and into the driveway, he felt a surge of cold resolve. He loaded the bag into his car and slid into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly. From his rearview mirror, he could see Rachel standing at the kitchen window. She didn't look worried or sad. She looked relieved. He started the car and pulled out of the driveway, driving down the street at a steady pace. At the first intersection, he turned left instead of right, heading toward the small motel he had booked earlier that morning. Once inside the motel room, John placed his duffel bag on the bed and sat down heavily in the chair by the window. The plan was in motion. Rachel thought he was miles away, too busy to notice what she was about to do. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to Martin Kane, the private investigator. I'm out. Keep eyes on her tonight. Martin's reply came almost immediately. She's already on the move. Stay sharp. John leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. This was it, the calm before the storm. John sat in the cramped motel room, his laptop open on the small desk. A single dim lamp illuminated the space, casting long shadows on the walls. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he scrolled through the restaurant's website. A high-end establishment with an elegant dining room, soft lighting, and private seating arrangements, exactly the type of place Rachel and Edward would choose for their clandestine meeting. He clicked the "We reserve a table" button and selected a spot. He smirked when the floor plan popped up, showing the layout of the tables. Edward had reserved a table for two near the window. John deliberately chose one nearby, positioned just far enough to remain unnoticed, but close enough to observe everything. The phone rang twice before a woman answered, her tone polite and professional. "Ristorante La Luna, how may I assist you?" "Good evening," John began, his voice calm but firm. "I just booked a table for tomorrow night." "Table 14. "Yes, Mr. Hayward, I see the reservation here," the woman replied, typing rapidly. "How can I assist you?" "I have a specific request," he said, his tone dropping slightly. "It's for a special occasion." "Of course," she replied, her interest piqued. "I'd like to arrange for some assistance during the evening. It involves a bit of misdirection, nothing harmful, but enough to make an impression." There was a pause, and then her voice lowered. "What kind of impression are we talking about?" "I'll be leaving an envelope for your staff to deliver to table 12 at my signal," John explained. "And I'd like the waiter assigned to that table to make a few strategic mistakes. The wrong dish, a delayed drink, minor inconveniences to keep them unsettled." The woman hesitated for a moment before responding. "This is highly unusual, but we do accommodate special requests for our clientele." "You'll be well compensated," John added, his voice firm but smooth. "Understood, Mr. Hayward," she replied. "We'll make sure everything goes as planned." After confirming the arrangements, John turned his attention to the evidence he had meticulously gathered. The manila folder sat heavy on the desk, its contents a damning testament to Rachel's betrayal. He opened it and began laying out each piece. Photographs. Rachel and Edward walking hand in hand, laughing as they left a hotel. Text messages. Screen captures of their conversations, Rachel's cruel jabs at John, and her confessions of love for Edward. The DNA test. The cold clinical document that confirmed what John already knew: Liza was not his biological child. Next to the folder sat a smaller envelope, one he had prepared specifically for Edward. Inside was a simple note. "What will your wife say when she learns you're Liza's father?" He imagined Edward opening it, his smug expression crumbling into panic. John's jaw tightened. That moment alone would be worth all the effort. John packed the folder and envelope into a sleek black briefcase. Every item had its place, organized with military precision. He also included a small recording device. If Rachel or Edward tried to deny anything, he would have proof of their reactions, their lies unraveling in real time. As he zipped the briefcase shut, his phone buzzed. A text from Martin Kane appeared on the screen. "They'll be there at 7:30. She's already excited. Be ready." John replied with a single word. "Always." He scribbled a few last-minute notes in his journal, his pen moving quickly across the page. His plan wasn't just about confrontation, it was about control. Every detail had to be perfect. He knew Rachel's moves, her excuses, her attempts to manipulate. He anticipated Edward's cowardice, the way the man would buckle under pressure. John called the restaurant one more time. "One last thing," he told the hostess. "Make sure the envelope is delivered with their dessert. It needs to be the last thing they see before the night falls apart." "Understood, Mr. Hayward," she replied. As the clock struck midnight, John closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. The plan was set, every variable accounted for. Tomorrow, Rachel and Edward would walk into that restaurant thinking they were untouchable. John glanced at the folder on the desk, the weight of it symbolic of everything he had endured. His fingers brushed the edges as he whispered to himself, "You're not ready for what's coming." The restaurant buzzed with quiet sophistication, soft piano notes drifting through the air and mingling with the low murmur of conversation. Waiters in crisp black uniforms moved with practiced grace between the tables, balancing trays of wine glasses and elegantly plated dishes. Candlelight flickered across polished wood and pristine white linens, creating an intimate, almost dreamlike ambiance. John sat at table 14, half hidden by the edge of an ornate privacy screen that separated the tables. A newspaper lay spread before him, though his eyes never lingered on the printed words. His posture was relaxed, a glass of water untouched beside him, but his senses were razor sharp. He wasn't here to read, he was here to watch. At exactly 7:30 p.m., the front doors swung open, and they walked in. Rachel was radiant, her carefully chosen outfit exuding effortless elegance. She wore a sleek, form-fitting black dress that highlighted her figure, paired with heels that clicked softly against the marble floor as she walked. Her hair was styled to perfection, cascading in soft waves down her shoulders. A gold necklace gleamed against her skin, catching the light just enough to draw attention without being ostentatious. Edward followed close behind her. His suit was sharp, but it lacked the tailored precision of a man used to wearing such attire. His tie was just slightly askew, his posture a little too stiff, as though he were trying to project an image of confidence that didn't quite fit. Still, his face was lit with a smile, a mixture of pride and nervous anticipation. They paused by the maitre d's podium, exchanging a few pleasantries before being led toward their table. Rachel's hand brushed Edward's arm as they walked, her laughter soft but unmistakably flirtatious. John's grip tightened on the edge of the newspaper, his knuckles whitening for just a moment before he forced himself to relax. Table 12 was perfectly positioned near the large bay window overlooking the city lights. The waiter pulled out Rachel's chair first, and she sat with a graceful motion, crossing her legs and glancing around the room with an air of nonchalance. Edward sat across from her, leaning forward slightly as though eager to close the distance between them. John watched through the slits in the privacy screen, careful not to move too much or draw attention. His vantage point was flawless. He could see them clearly, but remained concealed in the dim lighting. The waiter approached with menus, and Rachel opened hers with a practiced flick of her wrist. "What are you in the mood for tonight?" Edward asked, his voice low and warm. Rachel smiled, a coy expression that John knew all too well. "Something indulgent. It's not every day I get to enjoy a night like this." Edward chuckled, adjusting his tie. "Then let's make it memorable." The waiter returned shortly, a pen poised over his notepad. Edward gestured toward the wine list. "A bottle of your best Cabernet Sauvignon," he said, glancing at Rachel for approval. She nodded, her eyes gleaming with anticipation. John recognized the name of the wine as it was spoken. It wasn't just any Cabernet. It was the same label Rachel had once chosen for their anniversary dinner. The memory cut like a blade, but he pushed it aside. This wasn't the time for sentimentality. "Good choice, sir," the waiter replied, disappearing toward the wine cellar. Rachel leaned forward slightly, resting her chin on her hand as she gazed at Edward. "You're spoiling me tonight," she teased. Edward reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "You deserve it. I want tonight to be perfect." John's jaw tightened, but he remained motionless, the newspaper shielding his face. As the wine arrived and glasses were poured, the atmosphere between Rachel and Edward grew more intimate. They laughed easily, their voices blending with the ambient noise of the restaurant. Edward leaned closer, his hand resting on the table just inches from hers. At one point, Rachel tilted her head, her expression playful. "You're getting bolder," she remarked, her voice low enough that John had to strain to hear. Edward grinned. "Maybe it's because I don't feel like hiding anymore." Her smile widened and she reached out, her fingers lightly tracing his hand. "Careful," she warned, though her tone suggested anything but caution. John's stomach churned at the sight, but outwardly he remained composed. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, the moment where their confidence would betray them. From his hidden perch, John catalogued every detail. The way Rachel's lips curled into a smile that used to be meant for him. The way Edward's hand lingered just a second too long as he handed her a glass of wine. The casual intimacy that spoke of a relationship far deeper than a fleeting affair. He resisted the urge to act immediately. The plan had to unfold precisely as he'd designed it. Timing was everything. The waiter passed by and John caught his eye, giving a subtle nod. The first phase of his intervention would begin soon. For now he waited, his heart steady but his mind racing. The atmosphere at table 12 was beginning to settle into the comfortable rhythm of an intimate evening. Rachel and Edward laughed softly, their conversation peppered with flirtatious glances and quiet innuendos. The dim glow of the candles and the rich aroma of fine cuisine created the perfect backdrop for their tryst. John, seated a few tables away, lowered his newspaper just enough to glimpse their growing ease. His face remained impassive, but his mind was sharp and calculating. He caught the waiter's eye and gave a brief nod. Phase 1 was about to begin. Edward had just taken a sip of his Cabernet Sauvignon when the waiter arrived with their meals. The presentation was exquisite, the plates adorned with delicate garnishes and swirls of sauce. "Here we are," the waiter announced, placing a steaming plate of seafood risotto in front of Edward and a perfectly seared filet mignon in front of Rachel. Edward stared at the dish, his smile faltering. I didn't order this," he said, his voice tight with confusion. The waiter tilted his head, his brow furrowing in mock concern. "Seafood risotto, sir. That's what's on the order." "No," Edward replied, his tone rising slightly. "I ordered the lamb. I'm allergic to shellfish." Rachel's eyes widened as she looked at Edward, her hand reaching out instinctively. "You're allergic? Why didn't you tell them?" "I did," Edward snapped, his face turning red. "It was in the reservation notes." The waiter blinked, feigning surprise. "Oh, my apologies, sir. I'll have this corrected immediately." He whisked the plate away with practiced efficiency, but not before John caught the slight smirk tugging at the corner of the waiter's lips. Edward let out an exasperated sigh, reaching for his wine. "Unbelievable," he muttered. Rachel leaned closer, her voice soothing. "Don't let it ruin the night. It's just a mix-up." As Edward took a deep breath, attempting to calm his irritation, the waiter returned with a fresh glass of wine for Rachel. But as he reached to place it on the table, his hand accidentally slipped, sending the deep red liquid cascading onto Rachel's dress. "Oh!" Rachel gasped, jumping back as the wine soaked into the delicate black fabric. The waiter's face morphed into an exaggerated mask of horror. "Madam, I am so terribly sorry," he exclaimed, grabbing a cloth napkin and frantically dabbing at the spill, only making the situation worse. Rachel waved him off, her tone sharp. "Stop! You're just spreading it." Edward leaned over the table, his brow furrowed in concern. "Are you okay?" Rachel clenched her jaw, her eyes narrowing at the waiter. "This is a custom dress. Do you have any idea how much it costs?" The waiter stammered, his face flushed. I'll bring soda water immediately to try and lift the stain." He hurried off, leaving Rachel seething. "This service is a disaster," Edward muttered, shaking his head. Rachel dabbed at the stain with her napkin, her irritation palpable. "It's fine," she said through gritted teeth. "We'll just get through the meal." Despite the initial mishaps, the evening began to regain some semblance of normalcy. Edward's lamb finally arrived, perfectly cooked, and Rachel took small bites of her steak, her mood slowly improving. Then came dessert. The waiter approached their table carrying 2 elegant plates, each adorned with a decadent chocolate soufflé. The aroma of rich cocoa filled the air as he set the plates down with a flourish. "Your desserts, madam, sir," the waiter said, bowing slightly. Rachel smiled faintly, but as her eyes drifted to the plate in front of her, her expression froze. Etched in delicate chocolate script across the edge of the plate were the words, "For Rachel and her beloved Ed." Edward's fork paused halfway to his mouth as he noticed the inscription on his own plate. His eyes darted to Rachel, whose face was now a mixture of shock and confusion. "What? What is this?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward, his face turning a deep shade of crimson, muttered, "It's probably just a coincidence. Maybe they put the wrong name." Rachel shot a sharp glare at the waiter, who was already retreating, his face a perfect mask of professional indifference. "This is ridiculous," she hissed, her voice low but laced with anger. Edward reached across the table, his voice soft and reassuring. "It's just a mistake. Let's not overthink it." Rachel exhaled sharply, picking up her fork with a huff. "Fine. Let's just eat." From behind his newspaper, John couldn't help the faint smile that tugged at his lips. The carefully orchestrated chaos was playing out perfectly. Rachel and Edward were visibly unsettled, their confidence beginning to crack under the weight of minor but consistent inconveniences. He made a mental note to tip the waiter generously. The man was proving to be an artist in disruption. As the evening progressed, John signaled subtly for the next phase. The game wasn't over yet. The tension at table 12 had already begun to simmer, thanks to the expertly orchestrated interruptions. Rachel shifted uncomfortably in her chair, fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. Edward's earlier confidence had given way to cautious glances around the room, as though he felt the weight of unseen eyes. The inscription on the dessert plates had been the final straw, leaving a crack in their facade. From his vantage point, John could see the growing unease in their body language. Rachel's polished composure was slipping, her smile no longer reaching her eyes. Edward's shoulders were tense, his gaze darting between his plate and the room around him. It was time. John folded his newspaper carefully, setting it down on the table. The scrape of his chair against the floor was deliberate, just loud enough to draw attention without being overt. He rose smoothly, adjusting his jacket as he stepped out from the privacy screen. Rachel didn't notice him at first. Her attention focused on Edward as she whispered something under her breath. Edward nodded, looking increasingly agitated. But then she glanced up and froze. Her eyes locked on John as he approached, her expression shifting in an instant. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and wide-eyed. The transformation was almost comical. Edward noticed her reaction and turned to follow her gaze. His fork slipped from his hand, clattering loudly onto his plate as recognition dawned. A thin sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead. John reached the table and stopped, his presence commanding without a word. He looked from Rachel to Edward, his expression calm but cold. Then, with deliberate precision, he pulled out the empty chair across from them and sat down. "Evening," John said, his voice steady and unnervingly casual. Neither Rachel nor Edward replied. Rachel's lips parted as though she was about to say something, but no sound came out. Edward shifted in his chair, glancing toward the exit as if calculating his chances of escape. John leaned back slightly, unbuttoning his jacket and resting one arm on the table. "Don't stop on my account. You are having such a pleasant evening." "John," Rachel stammered, finally finding her voice. What are you doing here?" He tilted his head slightly, his gaze pinning her in place. "Oh, I thought I'd treat myself to dinner. Imagine my surprise when I saw you two." Edward coughed awkwardly, fumbling for his napkin. This isn't what it looks like," he blurted. John's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "That's an interesting opener. What exactly does it look like, Edward?" Without breaking eye contact, John reached down and lifted the sleek black folder he had placed beside his chair. He set it on the table with a muted thud, the sound reverberating like a gavel striking in judgment. Rachel's eyes flicked to the folder, her expression tightening. Edward swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "Let's clear up any confusion, shall we?" John said, flipping the folder open with a deliberate motion. He slid the first photograph across the table, Rachel and Edward leaving the restaurant hand in hand, their faces lit with smiles. Rachel's hand flew to her mouth. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. John ignored her question, placing another photo beside the first. This one showed the two of them entering the hotel lobby, their bodies close, their heads tilted toward each other in an intimate exchange. Edward's face turned a deep shade of red. "This isn't... we can explain..." John cut him off with a raised hand. "Don't bother. I've seen enough." He reached into the folder again and retrieved the final piece, a copy of the DNA test. He slid it across the table, his movements slow and methodical. "This," he said, his voice colder now, "is the part where things get really interesting." Rachel's trembling hand reached for the document, her eyes scanning the bold text. "Probability of paternity, 0%. Her lips moved soundlessly as she read, her face contorted with disbelief. Edward leaned forward, squinting at the paper. When realization struck, his chair scraped back an inch as though he'd been physically struck. "Oh my God," he murmured, his voice barely audible. John leaned forward now, his gaze locked on Edward. "How does it feel?" he asked evenly. "To know you've spent years playing house with another man's family." Edward stammered, his hands shaking as he held up his palms. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." John's laugh was low and humorless. "Of course you didn't. That would require a backbone." Rachel finally looked up, her face a mixture of guilt and defiance. "John," she began, her voice wavering, "it's not what you think. We can talk about this." John's gaze snapped to her, silencing her instantly. "Talk?" he repeated. "You mean like you've been talking to him? Or perhaps like you've been talking about me?" Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but John didn't flinch. He turned his attention back to Edward, who looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "You're going to want to call your wife Edward," John said, his tone as sharp as a blade. "She deserves to know exactly what kind of man she's married to." Edward's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. John sat back, his presence looming over them like a storm. He wasn't finished yet, but he didn't need to say more right now. The silence that hung between them spoke volumes. The silence at the table was deafening, broken only by the faint clink of silverware from nearby diners. Rachel sat frozen, her trembling hand clutching the DNA test, her face pale as the weight of its implications bore down on her. Edward, meanwhile, shifted in his seat, sweat gathering at his temples, his panicked eyes darting between the incriminating documents and John's cold, steady gaze. John leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the edge of the table, his movements measured and deliberate. The air around him crackled with tension as he reached into the black folder once more. "Since it seems we're already on a roll," he said, his voice as sharp as a blade, "let's continue peeling back the layers, shall we?" John pulled out another photograph, larger and clearer than the ones before, and slid it across the table. It showed Rachel and Edward stepping out of a dimly lit hotel, her hand on his arm, their faces glowing with unmistakable intimacy. Rachel's lips parted as though she wanted to speak, but no words came. Her fingers twitched slightly, hovering over the image before she snatched her hand back as though touching it would make it more real. Edward finally broke the silence. That could be anyone, he stammered, his voice cracking. John's expression didn't waver. He flipped over another photograph. This one captured them laughing together over dinner at the same restaurant they now sat in, their faces turned toward each other, unguarded and unmistakable. "Would you like to keep pretending, Edward?" John asked, his tone eerily calm. "Because I've got plenty more." Edward slumped slightly in his chair, his attempt at defiance dissolving under the weight of the evidence. John's hand returned to the folder, pulling out the document that had haunted him for days. He placed it carefully on top of the photographs, tilting it just enough for both Rachel and Edward to read. Rachel's chest rose and fell rapidly as her eyes scanned the words again, the bold text. Probability of paternity, 0%. Staring back at her like an accusation, Edward leaned forward, his jaw tightening as he took in the document. What is this?" he demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. John's gaze was unflinching. "It's exactly what it looks like," he said coolly. "Liza is your daughter, Edward." Rachel finally snapped, slamming her hands on the table. "How did you get that?" she hissed, her voice low but venomous. John tilted his head slightly, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "You should have been more careful with your insurance claims, Rachel. Apparently, private labs keep excellent records." Before either of them could recover, John reached for the final piece of evidence. He retrieved a small stack of printed screenshots, fanning them out across the table like a hand of cards in a high-stakes game. Rachel's face drained of what little color remained as she recognized the messages, the familiar exchanges of her and Edward's private conversations. "Rachel, I can't wait to see you again. Being with you makes me feel alive." "Edward, what if he finds out?" "Rachel, don't worry, he's clueless. He won't even notice if we move the meetings to weekends." Edward's hands trembled as he reached for one of the sheets, his voice shaking. You said he'd never find out," he muttered, glaring at Rachel. Rachel clenched her fists, leaning forward. "And you believed that?" she snapped. "You think I can control everything?" John watched the exchange with detached amusement, letting them unravel in front of him. "You said you had it under control." Edward's voice rose, his frustration boiling over. "You told me." Rachel interrupted him, her tone biting. "What did you expect me to say, Edward? That this would all work out perfectly? That's not how life works." John's chuckle cut through their argument like a whip. "Oh, please keep going," he said, his voice laced with mockery. "It's fascinating watching the two of you squirm. You deserve each other, truly." Both Rachel and Edward turned to him, their anger momentarily united, but John's cold, unwavering stare stopped them in their tracks. "I want you to understand something," John said, his tone dropping into something deeper, more dangerous. "This isn't just about you cheating, Rachel. It's about the years of lies, the humiliation, the fact that you let me believe Liza was my daughter while you played house with this coward." Edward opened his mouth to protest, but John silenced him with a sharp look. "And you," John said, pointing at Edward, "you don't get to walk away from this unscathed. Your wife, your kids, they're going to know exactly what kind of man you are." Edward's face went pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "You wouldn't," he whispered. John leaned in, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "Try me." Rachel buried her face in her hands, her shoulders trembling. Edward sat back, defeated, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for an escape. But there was none. John had them cornered, and they both knew it. For the first time in a long while, John allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The storm John unleashed didn't stay confined to the restaurant. By the time Rachel and Edward walked out into the crisp night air, their world had already begun to crumble, The confrontation had left them shaken, but it was only the beginning. The next morning, Rachel sat at her desk in the HR department of her firm, her fingers nervously tapping on her keyboard. She had barely slept, haunted by John's cold, cutting words and the stack of evidence he had laid bare. Every time her phone buzzed, she jumped, half expecting another bombshell to drop. By noon, it did. Her boss, a stern woman named Margaret with years of corporate experience etched into her face, appeared at the door of Rachel's office. "Rachel," Margaret said sharply, "my office. Now." Rachel's heart sank. She followed Margaret down the corridor, past rows of cubicles where her colleagues glanced at her with a mixture of curiosity and pity. The moment the door closed, Margaret dropped a folder onto the desk with a loud thud. Rachel recognized it immediately. Screenshots of her private messages with Edward, the hotel photos, the damning evidence of her affair. "Care to explain this?" Margaret asked, her tone ice cold. Rachel's mouth went dry. "Margaret, this is a misunderstanding. It's personal. It has nothing to do with—" "Stop!" Margaret's hand shot up, silencing her. "This isn't just personal, Rachel. This is a PR disaster waiting to happen. Do you have any idea how this reflects on the company? You're the head of HR, for God's sake. And you've been having an affair with a subordinate?" Rachel opened her mouth to protest, but Margaret's glare froze her in place. "You're finished here," Margaret said bluntly. "Pack your things. Security will escort you out." Rachel's breath hitched, her carefully constructed world collapsing in an instant. "Margaret, please," she pleaded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I've worked here for years. You can't do this." "You did this to yourself," Margaret replied coldly. By the end of the day, Rachel walked out of the building carrying a single cardboard box, her colleagues' whispers following her every step. Edward's situation unraveled even faster. When he arrived home that evening, his wife, Lisa, was waiting for him in the living room. Her arms were crossed, her face pale but set in stone. "Sit down," she said, her voice sharp and steady. "Lisa, I can explain—" Edward started, but she cut him off. "I said sit down." He obeyed, his knees weak as he sank onto the couch. Lisa tossed a stack of printed messages onto the coffee table. Edward's heart sank as he recognized the texts between him and Rachel, the same ones John had shown at the restaurant. "You thought I wouldn't find out," Lisa demanded, her voice rising. "You thought you could sneak around with her and I'd just stay here, clueless, raising your kids." "Lisa, please," Edward stammered, reaching for her hand. "It didn't mean anything. I was stupid." "Stupid doesn't cover it, Edward," she snapped, stepping back out of his reach. "Do you have any idea what you've done to this family, to me, to the kids?" "Lisa, I'm sorry," Edward said, tears forming in his eyes. "We can fix this. Please, just give me a chance." "No," Lisa said firmly. "You've had enough chances." By the end of the night, Edward was packing his bags. Lisa had already called her lawyer, and he knew there was no coming back. Edward's troubles didn't stop at home. By the next morning, word of the scandal had reached his office. His boss, a no-nonsense executive with little tolerance for drama, summoned him into a conference room. "We've received some troubling information, Edward," the boss began, sliding a familiar folder across the table. "Your behavior is unacceptable, both personally and professionally. We can't afford to have someone with your lack of judgment representing this company." "Please, give me a chance to explain," Edward begged, his voice cracking. The boss stood, buttoning his jacket. "Your personal life is your business, but when it affects the company, it becomes ours. You're fired. Clear out your desk." Edward slumped in his chair, the weight of his choices crushing him. Meanwhile, Rachel's relationship with her daughter Liza faced an even deeper fracture. When Rachel arrived home, hoping to find some solace, she was met with silence. Liza sat in her room, her back to the door, her shoulders stiff with tension. "Liza," Rachel began softly, stepping into the room. "Can we talk?" Liza didn't turn around. "Why did you lie to Dad?" she asked, her voice small but filled with anger. Rachel froze. Sweetheart, I never wanted to hurt you, she said, her voice cracking. You hurt him, Liza said, finally turning to face her mother. Her eyes were red from crying. And you hurt me. Rachel reached for her, but Liza flinched away. I don't want to talk to you, she said coldly. Just leave me alone. Rachel stood there for a moment, her hand hovering in the air, before retreating to her own room. For the first time, she truly felt the magnitude of what she had lost. The fallout from John's revelations was swift and merciless. The once perfect lives of Rachel and Edward had unraveled, leaving them standing amidst the ruins of their choices. The morning sun streamed through the windows of John's office as he leaned back in his chair, the finalized divorce papers resting neatly on his desk. The bold black ink on the signature lines felt heavier than it should have, a testament to the end of 15 years of marriage. He ran his fingers over the edges of the document, his thoughts a mix of relief and lingering sorrow. The fight for custody of Liza had been grueling, but in the end, the evidence of Rachel's betrayal had worked in his favor. The court granted him full custody, deeming him the more stable parent. That decision was a victory, but it came with the knowledge that Liza would bear the emotional scars of her mother's choices. John met his lawyer, a sharp and efficient man named Garrett, at the courthouse to finalize the proceedings. As they walked out into the cool autumn air, Garrett clapped a hand on John's shoulder. It's done, Garrett said. You got everything you wanted, full custody, the house, and no alimony payments. Not many men walk away with that kind of outcome. John nodded, his face stoic. It's not about winning, he replied. It's about protecting my daughter. Garrett tilted his head, studying him. You've been through hell, John. Take a moment to let it sink in. You've earned it. John allowed himself a small, tight smile. I'll celebrate when I'm sure Liza's okay. The days that followed were a mixture of rebuilding and rediscovery. John threw himself into his business, expanding the security firm he had founded after leaving the military. His reputation as a no-nonsense, results-driven professional brought in a steady stream of high-profile clients, and the company thrived under his leadership. In the evenings, his focus shifted to Liza. He made it a point to be present for her in ways he hadn't been before. Dad, can you help me with this? Liza asked one night, holding up a confusing math worksheet. John glanced up from his laptop and smiled. Of course, let's figure it out together. As they worked through the problems, he noticed how much lighter she seemed, still hurting, but healing. John also found unexpected support from his friends, many of whom had rallied around him during the darkest moments of the divorce. One evening, his longtime friend Martin Kane, the private investigator who had uncovered Rachel's affair, invited him out for drinks. To new beginnings, Martin said, raising his glass. John smirked, clinking his glass against Martin's. To never going through that again, he replied, his tone dry but genuine. The bar was lively, filled with chatter and laughter. For the first time in months, John felt like he could breathe. He listened to Martin's stories, laughed at old jokes, and even allowed himself to enjoy the attention of a few curious glances from women nearby. You know, Martin said, leaning in slightly, you're not as bad off as you think. Some guys would kill to have what you've got now, a fresh start, no baggage weighing you down. John chuckled. Yeah, well, let's see how that fresh start goes. Right now, I've got a teenager who needs me more than anyone else. Martin nodded, raising his glass again. And that's why you'll be just fine. One afternoon, as John was sorting through paperwork in his home office, Liza walked in, holding a framed photo of the three of them, John, Rachel, and Liza, from years ago. Do you want this? She asked hesitantly. John looked at the photo for a long moment before shaking his head. It's yours if you want it, but if you don't, we don't need to keep it around. Liza studied the picture before setting it down on the desk, her face thoughtful. I think I'm okay without it, she said softly. John smiled, pride swelling in his chest. Me too. As the weeks turned into months, John began to feel the weight of his past lifting. He redecorated the house, clearing out remnants of the life he had shared with Rachel. He focused on creating a warm, welcoming space for Liza, a place where they could build new memories together. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a movie, Liza leaned her head against his shoulder. "Thanks for being here, Dad," she said quietly. John kissed the top of her head, his heart full. "Always, Liz." At a charity gala a few months later, John stood by the bar, nursing a glass of bourbon and surveying the room. He wasn't looking for anyone or anything in particular, but the possibility of something new no longer felt impossible. "Excuse me," a voice said, pulling him from his thoughts. He turned to see a woman with kind eyes and an easy smile. "Is this seat taken?" John gestured to the empty stool beside him. "Not at all." As they began to talk, he felt a spark of something he hadn't expected. Hope. The restaurant looked exactly the same, with its elegant chandeliers casting warm light over polished tables and soft piano music floating through the air. The scent of freshly baked bread and seared meats wafted through the room, mingling with the gentle hum of conversation. John Hayward sat at a table near the large bay window, the same spot where, a year earlier, his life had unraveled in dramatic fashion. This time, however, the atmosphere around him was entirely different. Across from him sat a woman with auburn hair tied neatly into a loose bun, her laughter light and genuine as she recounted an anecdote about a disastrous cooking experiment. Her name was Claire, and though they'd only been dating for a few months, her presence had already begun to feel like a welcome constant in his life. Beside John, Liza sat with a contented smile, the stress and uncertainty of the past year replaced with a youthful glow that had been missing for far too long. "I'm telling you," Claire said, shaking her head as she laughed. "The smoke alarm went off so many times, I'm pretty sure my neighbors called the fire department just to be safe." Liza giggled, pushing her glass of sparkling water aside. "That's nothing," she said, turning to Claire. "Dad once tried to make a birthday cake for me when I was 8. He used salt instead of sugar." John groaned, leaning back in his chair. "Are we really going to bring that up tonight? It was one time." "One unforgettable time," Liza quipped, her grin wide. Even Claire couldn't hold back her laughter. "Well, at least you're good at other things, John." John raised his glass, a smirk tugging at his lips, like making sure I never step into a kitchen unsupervised again. As the waiter arrived with their entrees, John took a moment to observe the scene. The last time he'd been here, he had been a man on the verge of implosion, consumed by betrayal and rage. Now, the weight that had once pressed on his shoulders was gone. Liza looked up from her plate of pasta and caught his eye. "You okay, Dad?" she asked softly. He nodded, his expression softening. "Never better, sweetheart." Claire glanced between the two of them, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. "This place seems to mean something to you," she said, her tone curious. John hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. "Let's just say it's where I closed one chapter and started another." Claire didn't press him further, sensing that whatever had happened here before, it was a story for another time. As the evening wound down, the same waiter who had orchestrated John's earlier manipulations approached their table, his demeanor professional yet familiar. His eyes flickered with recognition as he glanced at John, though he didn't let it show too overtly. "Mr. Hayward," the waiter said with a polite smile, "how is your evening tonight?" John's gaze swept over the table, Liza's laughter, Claire's warmth, the calm and joy that had returned to his life. He met the waiter's eyes, his own filled with quiet gratitude. "Best evening of my life," John replied simply, raising his glass in a small toast. The waiter nodded, stepping back with a satisfied smile. As they left the restaurant, the cool evening air greeted them, carrying the distant hum of the city. Liza walked ahead, her steps light and carefree as she hummed a tune under her breath. Claire fell into step beside John, her hand slipping into his. "You know," she said, glancing up at him, "I've been meaning to ask, how did you even find this place? It's perfect." John chuckled, his thumb brushing against hers. It wasn't always this perfect, but sometimes places have a way of changing when you see them in a new light. Claire raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, but let the moment pass. As they reached the car, Liza turned back to face them, her smile wide. "Dad, can I pick the music on the way home?" "Only if it's not that awful pop playlist," John teased. Liza rolled her eyes dramatically but climbed into the car with a laugh. Claire lingered by John's side for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way, haven't you?" she said softly. John exhaled, his gaze drifting back toward the restaurant. The memories of betrayal, the anger, the pain, they no longer weighed him down. Instead, they felt like distant echoes, reminders of how far he had come. "I have," he said, his voice steady, "and I'm not looking back." As they joined Liza in the car, laughter filled the air, the kind of laughter that signaled healing and hope.